Thank you.
Hi, everybody. How are you? You know, this is just an excuse for me to get to talk to you about writing. We're friends, and we haven't really sat down. Starting off that way, but it's good. I heard that's a good sign.
If it's my mother, tell her I'm busy.
I think that writers, get to see each other often in like the company of other writers, but here, let's pretend nobody else is here.
Okay.
It's just us, and we're going to talk about the things we've never talked about. Well, first, I love your book. It's fantastic. And how many of you have read it? Oh. Thank you. Wow. So, how many of you have already read Table for Two? Amazing. All right. I'm going to have to ask the rest of you to leave. This is for us. No, it's a wonderful book, but I thought tonight, in addition to talking about the book, and there will be questions, and I've been warned that somebody will sneak up behind me and hand me the questions, so if I jump, that's what that's about. I thought we could talk about writing more generally, so I wanted to throw a line out at you that's really spoken to me as a writer. It's a line from a Zadie Smith essay, and she says, "When I write, I'm trying to express my way of being in the world." I love that line. Do you feel that that's true for you?
My way of being in the world. Is that what that's what you're the quote?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a lovely quote of Zadie's. I suppose that's true of all authors, consciously or unconsciously.
How conscious are you?
Yeah, I don't think about it in that way. Well, first of all, there's many fiction writers who draw very actively from their own experiences to populate their fiction, and they're examining, in a way, their lives in a very direct sense in their work. I clearly don't do that, right? So, Updike and Raymond Carver, John Cheever, these are authors who got great artistic energy out of exploring their immediate milieu, the people they knew, the things they had witnessed, the things they had been through. Philip Roth, you can add to that list. Edith Wharton. But for me, I'm an author who likes to be displaced. So I enjoy the process of being in a situation that I have not been in, imagining the experience of a person who I am not, going through experiences that I've never had. And that, I find that I'm a sharper observer in that mode. And for me, I guess it all goes back to what are you trying to achieve in a book. I do try to create fiction that has a shot at, I'm not interested in writing timely work, is the best way I can put this. I think there's nonfiction writers are very often writing timely work, and they should be, right? If you're writing about the White House, you're writing about the rise of AI, you're writing about whatever issues that are racism in America today. So a lot of nonfiction is timely in a very important way. Some fiction is written in a timely fashion, and I really don't trust myself in doing that. I'm much more interested in trying to write something which is timeless. And so, again, the stepping away from myself and trying to imagine a story from the beginning to end as a whole sort of experience, that's sort of almost like a little supernova that grows from out of an idea and is its own private universe, that's an arena that I feel like I can achieve what I want artistically better than if I was doing, autofiction. So going back to your question, right? So however Zadie Smith put it, if I am creating some extension of myself or my world, it's coincidental as opposed to fundamental to what I'm doing.
But would you say, though, that your way of being in the world has been to be an observer much of your life? Is that a main role that you would ascribe to yourself?
Yeah, and I think that I knew I wanted to be a writer when I was in first grade. So it was very early. In first grade, our teacher brought a poet named David McCord to our class. David McCord at the time was probably in his 60s and was a well-known writer of juvenile poetry for the young in the Northeast. And he came, and we all sat on the carpet around in a little semicircle, and he read from his poetry. And I just remember being like, this is awesome. I just, thought this was the most amazing thing. I loved the wordplay in his poetry. I liked the rhymes. I liked the humor in it. I liked the observations that he was making about daily life and simple things through the verse. I liked the fact that we were all gathered around listening. Yeah. And at the end, he signed the books, and we got to take one home. And really that night, the next night, something like that, I took an empty notebook and began writing poetry that mimicked what he was doing. And it's been that way ever since. Read, write, repeat. So as a young kid, falling in love with short stories of Ray Bradbury, and then I started with the Hardy Boys, really, I guess, but then Ray Bradbury and Agatha Christie, and then you get to high school, and a book is assigned to you. It was probably something like Heart of Darkness, and I remember reading it and being like, oh, okay, this is what a book can do. This is what a book can be. I've really enjoyed language and narrative up to now, but now I begin to see how a talented author at the height of their powers can create this work of art that reverberates and opens doors and stimulates ideas and feelings, all in sort of a beautiful poetic form. And so then it begins the hunt, where you're like, okay, what else is out there? And you start, in your late teens, early 20s, I'm just reading everything, the Russians, the Marquez and the magical realists, and the American Renaissance writers, Melville and Thoreau and Whitman, and then you read the post-war French. And each time you're learning something new about what a novel can be, but you get to the post-war French, and they're writing books where the characters don't have names, and there's no quotation marks, and nothing happens.
I like those little dashes.
Yes, the dashes, and I'm like,
makes
this
it look
is
so
amazing.
important.
So it's like, but you're like, okay, this is a novel too, and so they say it's a hunt, and I think the way you kind of think of it is because we all read and we all enjoy books, and we're entertained and moved by them, and our thoughts are stimulated by them. But a difference between most readers and sort of the young reader-writer, is that I think the best way I can describe this is through an analogy. And the analogy is you're invited to a party, and let's say it's a big, fancy party. It's Gatsby's house in West Egg. You're invited, and so when you come and you go through the door, of course you are going to admire the grandness of the surroundings. You are going to enjoy the sound of the music drifting from the terrace through the open doors. You're going to enjoy the food. You're going to have a fun conversation with a stranger while you're waiting for your drink at the bar. All right, well now, all of these things, everybody who's invited is basically going to have some version of those impressions, those experiences. But if you're the young reader-writer, what happens is that you're invited to the party just like everybody else, but you also happen to be a thief, right? So imagine arriving at the party and they're invited, but you are a thief. And so, yes, you appreciate the food and the music and the conversation, but as you kind of move through the house, you're in your head making a blueprint of the building. Exactly how it's laid out, how many windows there are, where they're located, where the doors are and where they're located. You're noting whether there's a dog on the property. You're noting whether or not the servants live in the house. You're gauging the value of everything you see. Is this painting by this Renoir? Is it a Renoir? Is it a fake? If it's a Renoir, is it a good one? What about the ceramics? What about the china? What about the silver? And of course, when you speak to the hostess, who's wearing an elaborate Harry Winston necklace with rubies and diamonds and emeralds, you are absolutely, in your head, taking that necklace apart so that the individual stones can be reassembled for pieces of jewelry that you could sell without fear of suspicion, right? So this is what's going on, I think, in the life of the young reader when they're reading a book, And since I'm the person who's the thief in this analogy, just for your mental picture, let's say it's Cary Grant, okay? So Cary Grant's reading, and what's happening is as you go through these different approaches to writing the novel or writing fiction, you're taking in not only the different ways in which a novel could be imagined, but you're developing, hopefully, a mastery over elements of craft, because each of those books is different elements of craft are being approached in different ways. And the novel has many elements of craft, 25, 30 elements of craft at least, in terms of the setting, the dialogue, the characterization, the development of themes, the poetry of the language itself. Of course, all of those elements like simile and metaphor and allegory and allusion. These are all elements of craft. The point of view, the tone, the structure of it. And each time you read a book as a hunter, you're trying to understand, okay, how is this author in this work approaching each of those various elements? And that feeds your ability the next time, your appetite to some degree. You're like, oh, that's cool. But when you sit down to write your next thing, hopefully you're not copying them per se, but you've internalizing it, and it's beginning to improve your command of the various elements of craft as you approach your own writing. And I lay all that out because I think that, for me, is more important than being the observer in the sense of, being at a restaurant and watching, how someone's behaving, or being at the family Thanksgiving and taking notes because my cousins are in a fight or whatever. It's not that. I don't do that kind of stuff. The world of the literature is the place where I've been the most closest observer. Does that translate eventually into, I think, to a different relationship to experience? I suppose so. But again, as I say, I don't tend to take notes about what happens to me or what I see.
I didn't think you did. But there's something there that, we like to sort of think of writers as having a particular voice. And I think it's more complicated than voice, though. It's also about the choices that you make that make you you. Like, you could recognize Amor's prose out of context, right? And what is that? I'm always wondering that fascinating thing. And that leads me also to a question I want to jump to about character. Because your characters are so vivid throughout this book, in the stories and in the novella. I mean, there's just, each one is sort of like a polished person in some way. My sense of character, and maybe you're quite different about it, is I think when I talk to students about character, about creating character, I have that feeling about, when you're at home and you suddenly want to talk to somebody on the phone, you don't need to talk to them, there's nothing you particularly need to ask them, but you want to talk to them. But you're kind of missing that beat of thinking about it. You know that if you talk to them, they will give you a particular feeling, right?
Yeah, it's interesting.
And when you have a character, and the character comes on the page, there's almost, to me, like a change in room temperature. And that character gives you a feeling. And I feel that way with your characters. Do you have something related or similar thinking about it now?
No, it's very, I like your phone call.
Yeah, but it's like we don't even think it through, but we're going for something. And maybe that's true in writing. Are we going for something without really knowing it when we say that when we describe a character in a certain way?
Yeah, so for me, the understanding of at least my approach to character, you have to go back and start with the fact that I'm a planner. So
right.
So my normal process, if I have an idea for a book, let's say a novel in this case, that grabs me, I will spend, and I decide I'm interested in this topic. I will start imagining everything I can about that story. So the events, the characters, the settings. And if it's really interesting to me, I'll start to I'll fill notebooks.
Yeah.
And so I might do that for 2 or 3 years, filling notebooks with every aspect of the story that I can imagine and think through. And only when that process is done, I sort of know the whole story, then would I make an outline and use that then to begin to write the book itself. And so there's this long-tailed process for me, which may be going on while I'm writing something else. So meaning while I'm writing A Gentleman in Moscow, I'm designing the Lincoln Highway, let's say. But the characters, therefore, are a big part of that. I'm certainly trying to imagine the rooms and the events, but really you're trying to imagine the people, so as you say. And I don't use real people as a foundation for my work, so they are inventions. And I think that, to me, the most interesting part of the process is you get a sense of a character. This is, and it might be a real sketch, a very simple sketch. I'll just use the Count from A Gentleman in Moscow as an example. When I was planning that book, right off the bat, I'm like, oh yeah, he's an aristocrat, right? And right off the bat, I could say, oh yeah, he was probably never been married. He's not quite a dilettante, but he's close. He loves food, he loves music, he loves literature. He's a sentimentalist. He's definitely an optimist. He thinks the best in people. He thinks that things will work out in the long run. You know, and he's a little vain. He's a little, you know, he can make mistakes. So I might have this sort of a rapid fire sort of sense of who he is. And it's not like I'm making a list of attributes and saying, you know, let's put those together. That all comes sort of whole cloth. That's the guy. I'm almost taking notes about who he is. Well, so that's sort of, you start there. But then what happens, this is where it gets interesting, I guess, is in the planning process, as you're imagining the events. I know the Count is going to be sentenced to house arrest, and he's going to feel a depression about it early on. He's going to feel claustrophobic. He's going to feel like he's no longer relevant in the world. And this is going to be a hard thing, and he's going to meet a young girl. And the young girl is going to turn things around for him a little bit. She's going to show him how exciting it is to sort of travel through the hotel, because she's trapped there too. She's going to look at it with the eyes of a child. She's also going to be his first friend in this new phase of his life, and a guy who's sort of suddenly very isolated. And so I know this. This is a part of the design. But so then I start to think about that more carefully. So what happens when they first meet? And let's start to imagine that. So it's going to be in the dining room. She's going to kind of pop up and approach him, having sort of been interested in him from afar. She notices that his mustache is gone. And so I'm starting to imagine that. And as I imagine it, she'll say something, and then I'll imagine the Count responding, and she'll say something, and I'll say, oh yeah, and the Count would say this. And then all of a sudden you say, well, you know, actually no, he wouldn't say that. He wouldn't say that. That's just the kind of thing he would normally say, but under this circumstance, talking to her at that moment, he'd actually say the opposite. And you're like, oh yeah, that's interesting. So when you have that moment, my inclination is you say, okay, let's go back to the beginning and think everything through again. Because we now have a little bit more elaborate sense of who he is, right? And then you kind of go through, and eventually he meets an actress, and they're going to flirt, and they're going to have an argument, and there's going to be a little sexual play, and et cetera. And they're kind of going back, and she'll say something, and the Count will do something, and then you're like, oh, wait, no. No, on that night, he'd do this, not that. And now I know him better. And so you go back to the beginning and start again. Because each time I know the character a little better, in theory, everything about the story should change a little bit. Right? The events, his actions are going to change, the way he talks about things will change, the thematics will change, because he's now a slightly different person. And I think this is very much, it's because I do this because this is the way we are, right? So we do not, you as human beings, we are not greedy or generous. We're not, shy or outgoing. We're not, whatever your adjectives. What we are is we have the capacity to be generous or greedy. We have the capacity to be shy or outgoing, depending upon circumstances, depending upon who we're with and what's been going on in our life recently and what was just said and whether we had breakfast. These kinds of things affect the way that we behave in that moment. So that means that the same individual, even though we might sketch them and say, oh, they're this, 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 and this, well, that person can act the opposite of any of those characteristics under certain circumstances. That's just the way we are. So as I say, the planning helps me discover these elements, these contradictory aspects of the individual, and that allow me to rethink the work. And I think that if I go back a number of these circles, and keep in mind I'm doing this for all the characters, in essence, is that slowly what's happening is they're approaching some version of, hopefully, three-dimensionality, And that's, if a reader is like, that character in one of my books is like, feels really alive to me, I think it's because of this process,
That's so interesting. But do you ever, in the middle of writing, realize that, he needs to change quite a bit? Like, often think about that wonderful title, by Grace Paley, Enormous Changes at the Last Minute.
The Last Minute, yeah.
So you're writing, you're actually in the work, and the character is like, we don't want to die, or whatever it is.
Yes.
What happens then?
I am an outliner and a planner, but what tends to happen is that when I'm, for instance, writing the first third of a book, the back third of the outline is growing and changing. Because now we're in the process of actually writing chapters, so it's sort of another phase. But yes, I'm continuing to learn about the characters and the story and the events and the tone, the poetry of it. I'm learning all that to a more specific degree while I'm writing, so the outline is changing. And yes, that can mean, but also surprises can come like that. And you know, that a relevant example here, very relevant, is that when I was writing Rules of Civility, the main character, the narrator, Katie, her best friend, Eve, is a Midwesterner who's a beautiful, very sort of sharp, energetic, independent-minded young woman. And I loved Eve as a character, and she and Katie had this great relationship. And she was the kind of person where she hates it when you think you know what she would do. And she would do the opposite of that just to teach you a lesson. You know what I mean? So they have this great relationship, and in the course of Rules of Civility, she has an accident where she's disfigured. She has, her career isn't very interesting to her. She has a romance that goes sideways. And so she eventually says, maybe it's 2/3 of the way through the novel, says, you know what, I'm out of here. I'm leaving New York. And as they were kind of a team. And Katie says, well, you know, what are you going to do? And she says, I'm going to go back to Indiana. You know, I haven't seen my folks in a while. And that was in the original design. It was in the outline. You know, I got right up to the moment. I'm actually in my chair writing the scene where Eve is on the train, and I've imagined the parents in Union Station, Chicago, meeting her and seeing her disfigured for the first time, or whatever, you know, for the mother. And as the train's approaching the station, you know, I thought to myself, she would never get off that train. You know, and really, to put it more accurately, Eve was like standing behind my chair, being like, I would never get off that train. You dummy, you know. And so, yeah, so like right there in the moment, she extended her ticket to Los Angeles, and disappears, you know, in essence, in Hollywood. And at the end of Rules of Civility, Katie doesn't know she's in LA, but doesn't know what she's doing. And a friend gives her a Hollywood magazine, and there's a photograph of Eve coming out of a nightclub on the arm of Olivia de Havilland in 1938, and it says, Gone with the Wind, or 1939, excuse me, and the caption in the photograph. And that's kind of all you know at the end of that book. And when I finished that book, I really had no desire to explore Katie or Tinker's life further. I felt like everything I should tell you is in that book. But I was really interested in what happened to Eve. And so I wrote 10 years ago a short 50-page piece called Eve in Hollywood, and it opens with Eve on the train. It's told from the perspective of 5 other people, and so there's a retired homicide detective on the train. He's seen her on the platform, this beautiful woman with a scar, and he's sort of interested in her, and then he sees her, he witnesses her extend her ticket in the dining car. And he's like, what happened? Why would a woman do that? You know, she didn't get a telegram, she's traveling alone. What would make a young person suddenly extend her ticket from Chicago to Los Angeles? This intrigues him. And eventually they sit opposite each other in the dining car, and he asks her. And this is kind of where the thing begins. And she then goes to Beverly Hills and moves into the Beverly Hills Hotel and meets an actor, and he then sends her off to a restaurant where she meets Olivia de Havilland, et cetera. And so when I was putting together Table for Two, 6 stories in New York, mostly around the year 2000, I was going to end it with these 50-page enigmatic Eve in Hollywood, which is when I handed that in. And the minute I handed it in, I regretted it. I called my editor, Paul Slovak, and I was like, hey, Paul, you don't start it yet, because you got to send it back. I'm not ready. Because or you can start reading the New York, but you got to give me back the Eve, because there's more to say. There's definitely more to say. So he sent it back. I took the 50 pages, and I boarded a plane. I flew to Los Angeles. I moved into the Beverly Hills Hotel, because that's the kind of sacrifice I am willing to make. And so, you know, like 7 days later, it was a 200-page novella, and that's what is. So half of Table for Two is now that novella.
You're brilliant and brave.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yes. Exactly. Very brave. Very brave. So yeah. So yeah. You know, the characters can, as you say, right up until the last page that she's in the book, she changed.
But that's part of the pleasure of writing, isn't it? The surprise
absolutely.
And all of that.
But it only has to. I think it only really works when the surprise comes, and your own feeling has to be, which is what the reader is going to feel, is, of course. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You can't be like, oh, this would be interesting.
No.
this would catch the reader off guard, because they're going to be like, oh, please. It has to come from something, that surprise has to be a revelation that you are understanding the character better than you did a minute before. And that's what, is at the heart of the surprise in the book.
I heard something about an acting teacher talking about memorizing lines and how actors memorize lines. And he said something about they have to learn the part so that it's the only thing the character could say.
Yes, right.
And I love that idea. So
That's a
that
beautiful
maybe
thing.
we need some kind of version of that.
Yeah, well, I do think of the work that I do in design and anticipation and preparing to write a novel, absolutely, I think, as parallels with the method acting or the versions of late 20th century acting strategies, around knowing the character so well.
Right.
That you could put them in any situation and the actor could anticipate without the play how they would act in this circumstance, because they have internalized the personality of the individual.
Right.
And I feel like that's the same thing that I'm doing, as someone who's following my character with a pen.
And I think it shows on the page. I can
thank you.
definitely see that. We should talk a little bit about the difference between writing novels and short stories, because you're known for your novels, and now here's short stories plus a novella.
Yeah.
We can also talk about the novella, which is a form that you don't see very often, but there is a kind of bias toward novels and away from short stories in this country, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm the host of Selected Shorts on public radio and the podcast, and I read so many short stories, and I find them thrilling, but I mostly do write novels. Tell me about the difference between them for you.
And it's funny, you say that. I was speaking somewhere when the hardcover came out, and a gentleman came up to me and he said, I'm a fan, but I got to tell you, I was a little disappointed when I saw that your new book was short stories, And he says, because, I really don't like short stories. And I said, all right, that's okay. I said, so what is it about, short stories that you don't like? And he says, I wouldn't know because I never read them. So anyway, but so I do when as I was kind of talking about that, being young and reading and writing and reading and writing, that was all short stories, right?
Yeah.
And I think for many of us,
People start off that way because it's manageable for
that's right.
young
It's
readers.
the best form in which to experiment and therefore master elements of craft. Yeah. Because if you try to do it in a novel, the nature of a novel is that a novel has choices made. It's going to have mostly potentially a single tone. It's going to be in a single location for the most part. It's going to have a single set of characters. And so when you're committed to a novel, you're not going to have the benefit of where if you wrote 8 short stories or 10 short stories during that time, each have a different setting, a different tone, a different character, different events, a different style. That's where you're going to be learning, right? So, or learning at a different pace. And so the short story is a very natural part of the trajectory of the development of the skills. But I did, I wrote all these stories in the last 10 years. And at the end of writing these stories, I was asked to judge the 2024 O. Henry Awards, which is an award for the best American short stories that were published in that year, and you give it to 20 stories. So the team reads 1,000, they give you 100, you read 100, and you choose 20. And we did an event under Meg's leadership for the short series. So having written these stories and then done that, this selection of stories for the O. Henry Prize, it was very much on my mind of what is the difference between these art forms. I just spent the last decade writing 3 novels, and now I've returned to the short story, and I've been reading short stories, and so to set this up for you, to share with you my impression, I have to open by saying that my favorite teacher in high school is a guy named Dick Baker. He's still alive, and Dick is a man of great intellectual curiosity and great intellectual rigor, and sort of a very honorable and forthright individual. And in our school, he was the guy who taught us really how to read. So how to take a book and underline it and circle it and track references and sort of begin to break apart how the short story or the essay or the novel is working. He was the guy who taught us how to write about what we'd read. So, how to construct a thesis statement and how to make an argument and how to use evidence from the novel to support the argument you're making about the themes that are in the story, what have you. So, it was a very central figure for me in my development. Well, when he would hand back our papers, which would all be marked up, the most common comment in my papers, in the margin, was the initials SUG. And that stood for sweeping, unsupported generality. And he meant that as a criticism, when it turned out to be like my superpower, right? So here is my sweeping, unsupported generality on the difference between short fiction and long fiction, or novel, as I see it. I think that, in retrospect, that the novel, one of the things that is essential to the novel is that in the first 30, 40, 50 pages, consciously or unconsciously, the author is going to be very focused on orientation, providing you, as the reader, with some sense of where you are in the beginning of this tale, right? So, and that means, when is this taking place? And keep in mind that when it's taking place doesn't simply mean a date, right? Because times, and even brief moments of time, have their feel, in a particular milieu, right? So you're giving that sort of sense. Where it's taking place. And again, that might not be an address or a state or a city because, a very small geography can have its own characteristics, and that has to be communicated. Who the people are in this story. What are their backgrounds? What are their personalities like? What are some of the things that happened in the recent past or far past that might have bearing on the story that's about to come? The introduction of some motifs that may show up later and contribute to the understanding of the novel as a whole, right? All this has to be kind of laid out and engineered into the early pages of a novel to orient you, the reader. Now, and with a fine novelist, of course, this happens invisibly. You do not notice it. And as I say, the author may not even be conscious of it, but it's happening, all right? And now, this is very important in a novel that this takes place. And that is because the way that the novel constructs meaning, in my opinion, is that it is through evolution, different types of evolution. So the most common being the way a character changes. At the beginning, we have a character. The character then goes through certain experiences, faces obstacles, overcomes the obstacles, takes actions, and as a result, there are consequences with moral implications, and all of this may affect that character and change the way that who they are, right? And that evolution of that character requires that you know who they are at the beginning to understand the way that unfolds. This is also true about the way the events unfold in some sort of cause and effect, fashion. Themes tend to be layered. As I say, motifs are gathered. These are all elements of evolution that require you start with some sort of clear sense of where you are. Even for, again, the reader, that could be unconscious. But a sense of confidence as you then begin to experience the changes in the course of the narrative, and that will give you sort of the cumulative sense of what it all might mean to you. Okay, so that's why it's so important. Now, none of this happens in a short story. There's no time for this orientation stuff, right? So the way I've kind of think of short stories is very much like you go to a restaurant, right? And you sit down, and there's a man and a woman at the table sitting next to you. Now, they're into it, something big, right? And they're so into their argument or what have you that they're not even lowering their voices anymore, right? So you hear everything they say. And, while you're pretending to read your menu, you're really like listening to them. And you're beginning to ask yourself, you're asking yourself, well, is that his wife? And how old is she? And what did he do last night? And who's Tony? These are the things, right? Now, so then, as you're piecing this together, and you sort of get, just as you're beginning to get a sense of what's going on, they pay the check and they get up and leave, And you're like, wait, you want to follow them out of the restaurant into the parking lot and be like, wait, I have questions, But they're gone. So this, I think, is what the short story is like. Short story is like, instead of this orientation dynamic and the unfolding of evolution and a big wrap-up at the end of the novel, this is a situation where you're dropped in and you have to start piecing it together as quickly as you can. Where is this? Who are these people? What are the stakes? Why is she angry? You know, why is he making those jokes? Whatever it is, you're piecing it together, and just at the moment where it's sort of coming into focus, it's over. The end, you know? And that's something really beautiful about that. And I think it's very liberating, I think, for the writer to have a chance to write in that format, but I think for the novelist, but I think it can be very liberating for the reader, too, is to have that feeling of just stepping in fresh into a moment in time, and at the end of it, having the responsibility and the freedom to imagine what are the repercussions of what just unfolded in these 10 or 20 pages, you know? And anyway, so that's the way I think about the difference.
That's a wonderful way, yeah, and it's implied. You want to think about what happens after they leave. Margaret Atwood said, maybe somewhat ironically, that the novel was about time, and that she didn't compare it with story, she compared it with poetry, and poetry was about eternity. I mean, there was a little bit of an arch quality, possibly. I'm not really sure of the tone in that. But I love the idea of the novel being about time.
Yes.
For some reason, time moves me, I mean, and a lot of readers, I think, very, very deeply.
Yes,
it's
I think you're right.
That we want to think about all the time. If you had to write something right now on stage here, I mean, would it be a novel or a story? Like, is it a mood that you want to be in to say, I want to live with these people for a long period of time and just go through time with them? Is that how you decide?
I think at this moment in my life, or in the last 20 years, the novel is the thing I'm most interested in writing, and I don't mean to diminish the writing of the short stories. I just mean that that's the thing that it takes up more of my mental energy, and my focus. It's the thing that I naturally am like, oh yeah, I want to do that, even though that's going to take me 4 years, and I don't share my work as I go with anybody, including my wife or my agent, or my editor.
Really?
So the 4 years is quite, you're going to go enter it alone and spend your 4 years alone with that material, and so I must want to do it a lot. You know what I mean? Because it doesn't sound very good on the front end. But what I found is that when I leave one novel, I'm ready not necessarily to start the next novel the next day.
Right.
And I have been planning the next novel, so I'm close. But I want some breathing room, and I want sort of a chance to sort of relax before I gear up. And that's when suddenly I'm like, oh, you know what? I think I'll do a short story.
So it's like a sorbet between courses.
For me, it kind of becomes that. I enjoy, and I still enjoy it. It's kind of thrilling and again liberating, because you're like, oh, I don't have to do all that other stuff that I'm about to have to do. All the heavy lifting associated with the novel, which I do enjoy and it's important, but nonetheless, you're also like, oh, here that comes, So it's a pleasure in the short story not to have to do that.
But these stories may be kind of like a golden sorbet in a way. I mean, like there is a novelistic quality to them as well. Like you take your time, which I love.
Yeah,
this
they're
is
longer
not
than usual.
Raymond Carver minimalism. This is something different.
Yeah, that's right.
Like I can tell you're a novelist, even though these are really good short stories. So there's that quality of your pleasure in both.
Yeah.
And how about your reading? Does it go in one way or another, novels versus stories?
I read much more. I read novels more than anything else by a wide margin. It's probably 80% of my reading or something like that, including nonfiction, short stories, comic books, whatever. 80% is.
Wow, 80%. I love the number attached.
I know, just pick that
like,
up.
what?
I have no idea where that came
I don't know
from.
what mine would be. That's.
I studied literature in college. I got a graduate degree in literature. And as I say, I've been a reader-writer since the beginning. So that's really where my love is in the novel in particular. But a big defining factor in my later life is that I'm a part of a book group, and we've been reading together for 21 years. There's 4 of us. It's 2 men, 2 women. We're all married, but our spouses are not involved. And we started this, as I say, 21 years ago, really with the goal of reading novels that we were confident were so rich and so well done, so interesting, that it was the kind of work that you could read at the age of 20, 40, and 60, and each time enjoy reading the book and walk away with an entirely new impression of what it means, generally, or what it means to you. And that's sort of a high bar. So we really have focused in the 20 years in reading mostly dead authors.
Mostly dead, they're a little alive.
Yeah, right, a little alive.
A little bit.
Yeah. So, whatever. And it's so, because I think it takes about, 50 years to take books that are, if you look back 50 years, there's a lot of books that are in the moment, that were being discussed in the culture and were on the bestseller list. Most of those have not survived. And the ones that have survived, that means a lot. The fact that they have survived that 50 years and continue to interest readers tells you a lot about the richness of that story or that text or that writing style or what have you. So we kind of use that as a clearing mechanism, because we don't have we don't have an infinite amount of time, and so we use that, and we work on projects. So for us, we would typically take an author and read 6 or 7 books by them in chronological order. We'll take a moment in time and read books by different authors that were in that moment in time, let's say, or a region. A fun one I always thought was we did Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, George Eliot's Middlemarch, Henry James's Portrait of a Lady, and Flaubert's Madame Bovary. And the project was called 19th Century Wives Under Pressure. Because that's what that was, And but when you read those 4 books side by side, it's very because they're all written within about 50 years of each other, like in a within a 50-year cycle. And Tolstoy's writing from Russia about Russia, and James is an American but living in England, writing about a character in Italy, and Flaubert is obviously writing about France, and then you have George Eliot. So it's 4 different writers from 4 different parts of the world around the same time, and it's incredible how much these stories overlap because they're dealing with the rise of the middle class, the increasing secularity of society, the role of women in public life and in the family, the new industrialism. All this stuff is a part of each of those explorations that are really focused on, as I say, a wife under pressure. And so anyway, this is the way that we kind of work. And so that the most valuable reading that I've done in the last 20 years tends to be from this group.
What are you reading now in that group?
So what we're reading now is what happened is we were reading Doris Lessing with the intention of reading a bunch of Doris Lessing. The Nobel Prize winner, none of us had really read her. We read The Fifth Child, which we enjoyed. We went on to The Golden Notebook, which was published around 1962, and is kind of written about the contemporary life and at the time. And it's very long, 600 pages, and it was a huge hit in our parents' generation. And all of our parents, either the mother or the father or both, had read the book or talked about the book, or we all had memories of it on the bookshelf, as it were. And we did not love it. I'm sorry, we didn't love it. And it was we were a little disappointing. There were many things about that we thought were fantastic, but it fell short of what we would have loved. And so what ended up happening, though, and this is kind of where it gets interesting, is we started talking about why this book was so popular in 1962-63, and why did our parents read it, and what did they take away from it, and what was so innovative about it at that time, and what was the social world that it was dissecting, and the philosophical world, the political world of that moment that is built into this interaction of the characters. And that got us into this conversation about, we were all born around that time. We're mostly born around 1964. And we're like, yeah, so this is interesting because this is a book that was written around the time we were born, loved by our parents' generation, describing their adulthood, and we inherited the echo dynamic of that. Even though we hadn't read it, its influence on them and their times had big influence on us in the way we were raised, right? So that opened the door. So we're reading a whole series of books published between 1962 and 65 by different novelists. So we did John Updike's Rabbit Run. We did V.S. Naipaul's House for Mr. Biswas. We're about to do Saul Bellows' Herzog, I guess. And it's been fascinating to see the sort of this moment in time, which, as I say, was the moment in time where our lives were beginning, being described by these eminent writers in very different ways, talking about different things.
I hear someone, thanks. Is there a time?
Thank you, sorry.
Oh, what time is that hard out? What time should I say? 8:40? I don't know. Okay.
Yeah.
Just go. We'll just
Go.
be here. I'm impressed by the volume that your group reads. Do they have jobs?
No,
Middlemarch, every book on that list
Yeah.
except Madame Bovary is incredibly long.
Well,
right? Madame Bovary is like a breeze. It's like a pamphlet.
Yeah, no. For the big books, we'll take 2 months. We'll do first half, second half.
And are they all writers or no?
Now, when we started, 2 of them were published and 2 of us were not, and all 4 of us are published writers at this point, yes.
So basically stand near him and you'll be a writer. That's just the goal. Okay, so some questions. When translating from page to screen, do you leave interpretation to the director or do you stay actively involved, keeping the visualization close to that from when you were writing?
Okay, and this is the question is presumably about A Gentleman in Moscow, which naturally, because it's the only book of mine that has made it to the screen so far. Lincoln Highway, I think, will end up there, is actively being developed and written. It's already, a draft of that is being written, it's already been written right now. But in answer to the question, I'm good friends with Michael Lewis, the writer of The Big Short and Blind Side and Moneyball. And so we were having coffee in Berkeley around the time that A Gentleman in Moscow was being developed by the team who turned that into the series. And he said, "Hey, Amor, how's it going?" And I said, "Well, they just sent me the drafts of the first 2 episodes. And they've asked me, for my feedback. But I think they might just be being polite, And there's a pause, and Michael says, "Amor, they're definitely just being polite. Not only do they not want to know what you think, they wish you were dead." Right. Okay. So, now it did not turn out to be quite that bad. But I get it, right? So the team that made A Gentleman in Moscow, did an amazing job, and I would say they were 80% true to the book, which you have to appreciate is an enormously high number. Again, 80%.
Yeah.
But it's an enormously high number in that arena because it can be 0. You know what I mean? They can take the book and can change everything, what it means, what it's set, how long the events are, who's killed, anything. So when they really are trying to hew as closely as they can to the world you've imagined, that's an amazing thing. And that was definitely true of the team who made A Gentleman in Moscow. The sets were imagined and drawn from the book. The costumes were. The narrative is spread out over the 30 years, just as it is in the story. The characters are very much as they were designed, as much as I imagined them. And Ewan McGregor's terrific, a fantastic job portraying the Count. But it is a hands-off thing for me. So I do. I am been involved in each case in choosing the director, choosing the writer, choosing the lead actor, but then sort of the notion is if I've been involved in that, I've had a chance to interview them and ask them about what they want to do with this or why they're doing it or how they imagine it, and then I have a veto. At the end of that conversation, I can say I don't think they're right. I don't think they're right for the project. That they don't get hired. So if I do, agree, yeah, let's go with these people. The production team is like, you got to trust them to do a good job then. That your input has been in choosing the team. Now step back and let them, do what they're good at, And so that's kind of the way it's been for me.
Great. Here's one. You have a deft ability to efficiently introduce and dispatch characters without any abruptness. In Moscow, you even begin breaking the fourth wall to do so. Can you please talk about this evolution in style as a writer?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think because there probably has been an evolution of that over my life as a writer, going back to my teens and stuff. But I appreciate the question. I appreciate the compliment. I do think the heart of what you're describing is really comes down to is really empowered by editing, by meaning my own editing. So you create like you talk about an efficient entrance of a character, introduction of a character. You might start with several paragraphs that set up who the character is and their arrival at the scene, giving the sense of what they're thinking about and blah, 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 all this stuff. And as you're rereading and beginning the process of editing your own work, at whatever stage that is, it could be while you could be doing that while you're revising that chapter early on, or it could be when the whole book manuscript's done and you're going back and you're doing it. That's when you start looking at that and saying, what he says to the grandmother the moment he arrives at the cocktail party, whatever that thing is that he says, that should tell you at least half of what's on that prior page. You know what I mean? So like all those things I've written about what his personality is and why he's angry and how his relation is to his grandmother and what his, where his role in the family, all that stuff. That should all be, if in the way that he comes in and says, Grandma, ba 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 ba, you should be like, oh, okay, I know this guy, And so you work on that, and that starts to give you the freedom to start crossing this stuff out, and you're constantly revisiting it with this in mind. It's really about pursuit of economy, the economy of language. How can I, with fewer and fewer and fewer words, have the impact of that individual? And so when it works, I think it can have that quality that you're describing in your question, which is that the person can come alive very quickly when you really have sort of battened all the hatches, as it were, in the introduction of that individual.
Cool. Your novel, A Gentleman in Moscow, paints such a rich, nuanced portrait of life under Soviet rule. In light of the current political climate and Russia's evolving global role, how do you think the themes of resilience, identity, and dignity and confinement in your story and in the line from Table for Two echo the present moment?
When I was saying earlier that I don't try to write timely work. I try to write timeless work, and I know that sounds a little pretentious, but that is the ambition. A good example of that is The Gentleman in Moscow. When I wrote that book, it came out in 2016, so I was writing it in 2013, 14, 15. Actually, Russia was quite open at that moment in time, and pleasant to visit, all things considered. And if I think about the timeliness of it, one of the things I loved about the description of that book, the pitch, the elevator pitch in my head. I remember my editor, when Rules of Civility came out, Penguin Random House Viking said, okay, we want to buy your next book. We love Rules of Civility. We'd love to buy your next book, sight unseen, money, here's the contract, here's the money, thank you. And they say, so what do you think you're going to do? And I said, I think I'm going to do is I'm going to write a book about a Russian aristocrat who spends 30 years in a hotel. And it starts in 1920s and ends, and they're like, what? Because it's a terrible elevator pitch. And that's what's so great about it, right? So, and that's what gives me confidence that it's like not timely and that it might be, and maybe it will be universal if I can do a good job. And so then what happens is that it comes out and it's received, and it's around the world. It was great, and people found things in it. People who weren't fans of Russia, or people who didn't know anything about Russia, but found some kind of universality in the story for their own purposes. Then and people are writing to me things like, they're writing from hospital beds, from prisons, from all kinds of versions of being trapped, and then you get COVID, And then it's a whole flood of people writing about reading the book in a time where suddenly they are trapped in their home with their family and the different things they're doing to get through that and make the most of it and to survive it. I got a beautiful letter from a lieutenant on an aircraft carrier, a nuclear aircraft carrier. They do 6 months at sea and 6 months off the boat. That's the way it works in that world. And this aircraft carrier was landing in La Jolla on March 16th was the date that they're supposed to put on dock and get off in 2020. And, on March 15, the Navy said, you're not coming in. We're sending you out for another 6 months. And you can imagine, right? There's thousands of people on an aircraft carrier. And they've been waiting 6 months at sea. They can't wait. Their families are on the dock, in essence, waiting to see them, their kids and the whole thing. And it's last minute, you're back out at sea for 6 months. And this lieutenant wrote me about, how awful that moment was and how finding A Gentleman in Moscow in the next 2 weeks, got him through that next 6 months.
Amazing.
So yeah, so you love that when that happens.
Yeah. Here's something different. Who was the best lyricist?
Bob Dylan. What do you mean? What? Is that a serious question? No, I'm kidding. I'm a big Bob Dylan fan. Bob Dylan probably had as much influence on my writing as almost any. It would be maybe in the top 5 of writers, who influenced me. Because the way that he as a young person listening to his music, the way that he used words in surprising ways, the construction of his phrases, the way he uses allusions and allegories, and once again, incredible emotional content it comes very quickly, right? When in some of his songs, if you like his love songs, and so that's teaching you the economy of impact in that sense. And
is there a line that you love that you think of his?
A lot of Dylan's?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't think there is a single line. I just love it all.
Yeah.
I do love it all. So anyway, it would be Dylan for me.
Oh, cool. Okay. How long did you have the story of Rules of Civility in your head before you started writing?
This is not uncommon for me. That the idea, the idea for I wrote Rules of Civility when it came out in 2011. I started writing it in 2006. So I was 40, plus when I began writing that book. I had the idea for that book when I was 26. And so I remember it very vividly. I was visiting somebody's house out on Long Island, and there was a collection of Walker Evans' photographs, the subway photographs, the photographs he had taken of strangers on the subway with a hidden camera. And I was going through that group of pictures, which Walker Evans wouldn't let anybody see in the 30s or 40s or 50s until an opening at the moment in the 1960s. And as I was looking at these very haunting photographs, I thought to myself, oh, that's amazing, right? Nobody sees these until 1966, almost 30 years later. Wouldn't it be amazing if you were at the opening, or someone was in the opening and they recognized, an old friend in one of the photographs? Yeah. And I was like, oh, no, even better. What if the same person, the person at the opening recognized the same person in two photographs, but the person had undergone such a transformation over the course of a year that she's the only one at the opening who can tell that the two pictures are the same person. And that's what I wrote on a card when I was 25. And over the years, I would go back and think about it, time and again, and be like, oh yeah, this could happen, that could happen, and little bits of it would kind of drift around in my head. But then when I really sat down to write a new novel around that time, around 2006, I was doing the planning around that time, that's when I really began to imagine it in its fullest form. But it was an old idea at that point.
I love the way we sort of marinate in things for a long time before they see the light of day. Right?
Absolutely. Right.
And it changes. I think we have time for one more. So this is kind of a lightning round. Do you have a favorite character from your books?
Do I have a favorite character from my books? The truth is, I think my characters is very much like my college roommates, which is that I loved them. We had so much fun together, right? And they were terrific people, terrific guys. and decades later, I saw them recently. When we get together, you pick up right where you left off, and there's all laughs and fun and, and interesting conversation and philosophical this and that. But the truth is, I don't think about them almost ever. You know what I mean? I love them. I love them. And so, so that's what it's like, right? I loved the character. Well, I'm writing John Moscow. I loved all those characters. Oh my God, I loved them all. And then you finish the book and you shift to Lincoln Highway and you're like, okay, and you kind of, and then I stop thinking about them entirely. Now, occasionally when they come up, I'm like, oh yeah, those are good guys, but I don't dwell on them. Now, can I share one other thing before we go?
Please.
You've all been very patient. Thank you very much for coming. And if we did not get your question, you can always go to amortowles.com, the contact page. You can send, your comments and questions come right to me, and which by the way, it has its drawbacks, right? Because it usually takes about 5 days for a book to come out for corrections to start rolling in. You know what I mean? But and it's interesting about an interesting thing about our times, I think, is that we have gotten to a stage where we as a culture, whatever, have come to expect or even demand more factual accuracy from our novelists than from our political candidates, right? Thanks. Which is crazy when you think about it, The novelists, we want them to be telling the truth, They're the guys who should tell the truth. So anyway, but I think what's interesting about that reality is that it's very modern. It's not. I don't think that the novel or narratives were read in this way, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 300 years ago. And if you go back to the beginning, of the height of English narrative in the English language, we have the height right at the start, basically, with Shakespeare. And when Shakespeare, you can go take Henry V, right, which is a terrific play. You can go, watch Kenneth Branagh's film if you have it, or you can go see a contemporary stage production. You can read it. It's terrific. Okay. And now, when Shakespeare wrote that play, he was not trying to add to the historical record of the 100 Years' War, right? He didn't go out and study what was the temperature on the battlefield and how many soldiers were in that particular battle and how many died of that particular. That's not what he was interested in, right? What he's interested in are things like, all right, how is it possible that a young man, Hal, who becomes Henry V, who at the age of basically 18 is a wastrel, he's a drinker, a gambler, a womanizer. How is it a man without ambition? How is it possible that he, at 18, just a few years later, becomes a king of great courage and integrity with a very sharp moral compass? How does that happen in a person in that short period of time? And now that he's king, and we're going to go to war with France, how does he convince his fellow Englishmen to leave their farms, their homes, to join him in this battle, knowing that half of them will never return? Right? What's the case that he would have to make? Right? And in making that case, saying, we're going to go to defend England. Well, what is England? What does it mean? Like, why does it matter? Right? These people from all across this island, who are radically different. If you go to the north of England and the south of England, these are people that are very different people with different lives and different backgrounds, yet feel bound together to go fight the French, whoever they are. Right? So these are the kinds of things that Shakespeare is interested in. And if you look at his plays, the settings are not very elaborate, right? The durations of the plays are not usually very long, right? The ensemble of cast members is relatively small. It's not huge. Now, what he's really interested in is creating three-dimensional characters, creating individuals in the play which have all of the virtues and vices, all of the complexities, the whims, the nuances, the contradictions that any of us would have, right? That's really his focus. And he's going to carefully create this group of people who have that level of three-dimensionality, and he's going to do something that raises the stakes. And then hopefully, through the manner in which this group exchange their ideas and sentiments, and through the poetry of the language itself, we will get some glimpse of the human condition in a manner that is timeless and universal. And that's the big project. Thank you very much for coming tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Meg.
Of
Thank
course.
you. Always.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, 92nd Street Live.
Talking to you.